Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're plunging into something utterly foundational to the modern world, something we interact with, well, every single day without even thinking about it. Print culture.
That's right. I mean, just take a moment to look around you or, even think about how you're accessing this conversation right now. Books, newspapers, signs on the street, the packaging on your food, even maybe a note stuck on your fridge. Print is just everywhere.
It really is. So integrated into our lives, it's almost invisible.
Exactly. It's become background noise, hasn't it?
Because it's so ubiquitous, we totally take it for granted. But what was the world actually like before print was, everywhere? How did this technology even begin? Where did it start? And how has its history fundamentally shaped the world we live in now?
That's precisely our mission for this deep dive. Using the source material you've shared as our guide, we're going to unpack that history. We'll trace print's journey from its earliest origins across the globe and explore its truly transformative impact. Not just on what people read, but, how they lived, on culture, politics, society, even on how people thought and talked to each other.
Okay, let's unpack this story then.
Yeah.
Where does it even begin? Because it's not the European story most people immediately think of, is it?
Absolutely not. No, the earliest print technology actually emerged way over in East Asia. The sources place its beginnings in China around AD 594.
AD 594. Wow, okay, that's centuries before Gutenberg. He usually gets all the credit in this conversation.
Yeah.
What did this early printing look like?
Well, it was a system of hand printing using wood blocks. Basically, you'd have characters or images carved into wooden blocks, right?
Right.
Then you ink the surface, and paper was rubbed against the block to transfer the image or text. And crucially, the paper itself was also invented in China centuries before that.
Oh, okay. Paper first.
Paper first.
Yeah.
And because the paper was often quite thin, they could really only print effectively on one side. So the sheets were then folded and stitched together to make what they called accordion books.
Hand carving entire pages into wood. That must have required incredible skill, especially to get the calligraphy right.
Oh, absolutely. Immense skill and precision. And for a long time in China, a major driver of this early print culture was the imperial state. They had this vast bureaucracy, you see, and they relied heavily on civil service examinations to recruit officials.
Okay, so exams.
Exams. Can you imagine the sheer volume of texts needed for that?
Textbooks, study guides, exam papers themselves, probably.
Yeah.
Massive quantities.
Exactly. The source material shows that as the number of exam candidates surged, particularly from the 16th century onwards, the sheer volume of state-sponsored printing just went through the roof.
So it starts largely as a tool for the state, right? For administration and education within that whole system. But it didn't stay just for official use.
No, not at all. By the 17th century, as urban centers and culture really flourished in China, the uses of print diversified massively. It wasn't just for scholar officials anymore. Merchants started using print for trade information, commercial news, that kind of thing. And reading itself started to emerge as a popular form of leisure.
Reading for fun.
Yeah.
That sounds like a pretty significant cultural shift.
It was huge, yeah. New genres popped up: fiction, poetry, plays, even autobiographies. And here's where it gets really interesting, according to the sources. Wealthy women, particularly in the 17th century, started reading a lot more.
Yeah.
And many women began publishing their own writings. We see wives of officials, even courtesans, becoming authors.
That's fascinating print, providing a platform for women's voices that far back. What a powerful example of its potential impact.
It really is. Now, much later on, China did eventually adopt mechanical printing technology, but it was heavily influenced by the West. The sources note that in the late 19th century, as Western powers set up trading posts and concessions in China, Western techniques and mechanical presses were imported.
Oh, okay.
Shanghai, in particular, became a key hub for this new style of print culture. It marked a gradual shift away from that traditional hand printing.
Right, so the technology sort of comes full circle much later. But China wasn't the only place in East Asia where print took off early on.
No, definitely not. Let's jump over to Japan. Hand printing technology was introduced there by Buddhist missionaries traveling from China around AD 768 to 770.
Buddhist missionaries again. Interesting.
Yeah, and the oldest known printed book in Japan, which is the Buddhist Diamond Sutra, dates to AD 868. And it even includes woodcut illustrations.
So images were part of print right from the get-go, basically.
Absolutely. Pictures weren't just in books, they were printed on textiles, playing cards, even paper money. Print really flourished in medieval Japan. Poets and prose writers were regularly published, which made books relatively cheap and abundant compared to, hand-copied manuscripts.
Cheaper and more accessible. That seems to be a recurring theme already.
It definitely is. And fast forward to the late 18th century, urban culture in Edo, that's modern-day Tokyo, saw this huge boom in illustrated collections. Things like ukiyo.
The pictures of the floating world. Those famous Japanese woodblock prints.
Those are the ones. That's print culture right there. The source material describes this whole collaborative process. Artists like Kitagawa Udamaro would do the drawing, then highly skilled carvers would translate those drawings onto the wood blocks, and then publishers managed the printing, the production, the sale. It was a whole complex ecosystem built around print.
And we can't forget Korea's contributions either. The source material emphasizes that.
Absolutely crucial contributions, yes. The source highlights two key examples that UNESCO recognizes as really significant. The Tripitaka Koreana,
right,
which is this massive collection of Buddhist scriptures carved onto about 80,000 wood blocks back in the mid-13th century. Just incredible.
80,000 wood blocks.
And then there's the Jikji from the late 14th century. This is considered one of the world's oldest existing books, printed with movable metal type.
Movable metal type in Korea. Late 14th century. That's a huge technical leap, well before Europe.
It's a really important technical milestone in the whole story of print, yeah.
Okay, so we have this long, rich history of print evolving in East Asia over centuries. How did this technology eventually start making its way west towards Europe?
Well, for centuries, trade routes like the Silk Route were the main conduits for goods and ideas moving between East Asia and Europe. The sources tell us that Chinese paper, which is just essential for widespread printing.
Right, you need something affordable to print on.
Exactly. Paper reached Europe via the Silk Route as early as the 11th century.
Paper was absolutely key. Before that, they were using really expensive stuff like vellum-prepared animal skins. It took ages to make.
Right. Paper made producing manuscripts, books, copied by hand a bit more feasible, but still it was incredibly laborious and costly. Then around 1295, the famous Italian explorer Marco Polo comes back to Italy after all his travels in China.
Oh, Marco Polo.
And the source material suggests he played a role in bringing knowledge of woodblock printing techniques back to Europe with him.
So Marco Polo wasn't just bringing back tales of exotic lands, but actual technological know-how, too.
Seems like it. Following his return, we start seeing woodblock printing being used in Italy, and then it begins to spread. But the sources point out something really interesting. For quite a while, the really fancy luxury editions were still handwritten on expensive vellum. Elite circles, wealthy libraries, they often viewed printed books a bit critically, saw them as maybe cheap or common compared to these unique handcrafted manuscript copies.
So initially, print wasn't automatically seen as better, just different, maybe even a bit lower status.
That's a great way to put it, yeah. It had to kind of overcome that perception. But the demand for books was growing faster than hand copying could possibly keep up. Manuscript production was incredibly expensive, needed immense labor, and the books themselves were fragile, hard to circulate widely, sometimes really awkward to handle and read. Meanwhile, woodblock printing was catching on for other things, printing on textiles, playing cards, simple religious pictures by the early 15th century. It showed there was a clear need for faster, cheaper ways to reproduce things.
And this growing demand, this need for speed, this brings us to the name most people associate with the printing revolution in Europe, Gutenberg.
This is indeed where Johann Gutenberg enters the story. The major breakthrough happened in Strasbourg, Germany in the 1430s. He developed what's recognized as the first known printing press, using movable metal type in Europe.
Okay, so how did he figure this out? Was it just a sudden flash of genius?
Well, not entirely, according to the sources. Gutenberg came from a merchant family, grew up around agricultural estates, so he would have seen things like olive presses, wine presses.
The screw press mechanism.
Exactly. And he was also a master goldsmith, really skilled in creating lead molds, so he brilliantly adapted existing technologies. The olive press gave him the basic model for the screw press part of the printing press, and his goldsmithing skills allowed him to create uniform, durable metal types for individual letters.
The movable metal type. That's the key difference from woodblocks carving whole pages, right?
Mm-hmm.
Individual letters you can rearrange.
That's the core innovation, yes. He perfected his system by about 1448, and the very first book printed using this method, the Bible. The sources mention he produced about 180 copies in just 3 years.
3 years for 180 copies of the Bible. I mean, compared to one scribe spending maybe years copying just one Bible. That's an incredible leap in speed.
It's almost impossible to overstate how fast that was compared to manuscript production at the time. What's fascinating, though, is that these early printed books, even the Gutenberg Bible, still visually looked a lot like manuscripts.
Really? How so?
Well, the metal type was designed to mimic handwritten script. The borders were often left blank so they could be illuminated by hand later. Illustrations were frequently added by artists after the printing. They even left specific spaces blank for wealthy customers to have custom decorations put in by hand.
So they were deliberately trying to make the new technology look like the old, expensive manuscripts to appeal to the existing taste.
Yes, exactly. Partly to appeal to that established market, especially the wealthy who valued the look and, the uniqueness of manuscripts. The sources even mention that the striking color used to highlight holy words in the Gutenberg Bible wasn't printed. It was added carefully by hand after printing.
Wow, that detail really underlines the transition, doesn't it? The new tech trying to fit in by imitating the old form.
Precisely. But the technology itself, the printing press, it spread like wildfire across Europe. Between 1450 and 1550, printing presses popped up in cities all over the continent. German printers who had the skills traveled widely and helped set up presses in new places.
And the numbers, the sheer output of books that resulted, the sources give some staggering figures.
They really are. In just the second half of the 15th century, so that's 1450 to 1500, an estimated 20 million copies of books were printed in Europe.
20 million in 50 years.
And then that number just exploded. It jumped to around 200 million copies in the 16th century.
From 20 million to 200 million in just 1 century. That is genuinely revolutionary scale.
It is. And this transformation, the shift from hand copying or woodblock printing to mechanical printing with movable type, it wasn't just about making books faster. The sources call it the print revolution because it fundamentally reshaped access to information, to knowledge, and ultimately it reshaped people's lives.
Okay, so print revolution, more than just a catchy phrase, it signifies a massive societal shift. What were the sort of immediate effects on people's lives?
Well, the most immediate impact was the emergence of what the sources describe as a new reading public.
Because books suddenly became much cheaper and more widely available.
Precisely. Printing dramatically cut the cost and the time involved in production. You could make multiple copies relatively quickly, flooding the market, making reading material accessible to a far wider slice of the population than ever before.
Right.
Before this, remember, the vast majority of people lived in a world of oral culture.
Right. The hearing public, as the sources put it, relying on information being read aloud, stories being told, ballads being sung in the town square.
Yes, exactly. Knowledge and entertainment were primarily communal auditory experiences. Books were rare, expensive, precious objects. The arrival of print meant people could potentially start reading individually, in silence, and much more often. But there was a big hurdle.
Literacy rates. Still pretty low for a lot of people back then.
Yeah, literacy wasn't widespread for a long time in many parts of Europe.
So if many people couldn't actually read themselves, how did printers reach them? How did they sell books to them?
This is where the interaction between print and that existing oral culture gets really interesting. The sources point out that even if you couldn't read, you could gather with others and listen to someone else read aloud.
Okay.
So printers quickly caught on. They started producing cheap, popular stuffed ballads, folk tales, poems, often with lots of simple illustrations. These were designed to be read or even sung in public gatherings like taverns or village squares. It bridged the gap.
So print wasn't just replacing oral culture, it was actually feeding into it, amplifying it in a way.
Exactly. Oral traditions found their way into print, and then printed material was often disseminated orally again. The lines between the hearing public and the reading public got really blurred and tangled up in fascinating ways. Print helped traditional stories and songs reach even wider audiences than before.
But print also had this incredible power to spread new ideas.
Yeah.
Right, even dangerous or revolutionary ones.
Absolutely. This is where its impact on the course of history becomes undeniable. Print created the possibility for ideas, even dissenting ones, to circulate incredibly rapidly and widely. Individuals or groups who disagreed with the established authorities, whether the church or the state, they could print their views, distribute them relatively easily, persuade others, and potentially mobilize people to action in a way that just wasn't possible before.
And the prime example the sources use here is Martin Luther and the Protestant Reformation.
Absolutely. Classic case. In 1517, Martin Luther writes his 95 Theses, basically a critique of certain practices within the Roman Catholic Church, like selling indulgences. Printed copies were made almost immediately and disseminated throughout Germany and then across Europe with astonishing speed. Luther's ideas, spread through countless printed pamphlets and books, were read and discussed by huge numbers of people.
And this directly fueled the massive upheaval of the Protestant Reformation.
Well, many historians, and the sources certainly support this view, see print as utterly instrumental in spreading the ideas that ignited that major religious and political schism. Luther himself totally recognized this power. He famously called printing the ultimate gift of God and the greatest one.
Wow. That's an incredibly strong statement about its significance. But if print could spread revolutionary ideas and challenge authority so effectively, it must have also generated a lot of fear among those in power.
Oh, it certainly did, yeah. The ease with which ideas could now be reproduced and distributed wasn't welcomed by everyone, not by a long shot. Religious authorities, monarchs, even some established writers and artists felt, well, a deep apprehension. They worried that uncontrolled print could spread rebellious and irreligious thoughts,
undermining their authority and their control over information.
Precisely. And there was also a fear, expressed by some traditionalists, that this flood of cheap print would somehow devalue more serious or traditional literature, make everything seem common.
So how did institutions like the Church react to this perceived threat?
Well, the Roman Catholic Church's reaction is a key example of the source's detail. They were really troubled by individuals reading and interpreting religious texts for themselves. The sources mention the case of Minocchio,
The Italian miller.
That's the one. A miller in Italy who read some books that became available through print and developed his own quite unorthodox interpretations of the Bible. He was interrogated by the Inquisition, persecuted, and ultimately executed for heresy.
Just for reading and thinking differently based on what he read.
Exactly. Cases like that fueled the Church's response. They imposed much stricter controls. Starting in 1558, they established the Index of Prohibited Books, basically a blacklist of publications that Catholics were forbidden from reading.
A formal list of banned books. A very clear attempt to control the flow of information.
Absolutely. And it wasn't just religious or state authorities who were worried. The sources also bring in the perspective of the famous scholar Erasmus.
Right, a humanist scholar.
Yeah, and even he expressed significant anxiety about printing. He complained quite vehemently about the swarms of new books appearing everywhere. He feared that the sheer volume, this glut as he called it, was actually detrimental to serious scholarship.
Information overload. Centuries before the internet was even dreamed of.
Spot on. He was genuinely worried that, and I'm quoting here from the source, stupid, ignorant, slanderous, scandalous, raving, irreligious, and seditious books would just proliferate and overwhelm everything, diminishing the value of genuinely worthwhile publications.
It sounds like print was seen as this force of chaos by some, not just progress, like it could unleash anything.
It really was, and the sources mention this fear was sometimes depicted visually, too. There were even prints showing a kind of macabre dance, where skeletal figures, like Death, were shown operating the printing presses, associating the new technology with chaos and the end of the established world order.
Wow. So this technology wasn't just seen as a neutral tool. It was perceived as having this immense power to either enlighten or corrupt, to build things up or tear them down.
Absolutely. It unleashed forces that were both celebrated and deeply feared, and that whole dynamic really played out as print's reach continued to expand across society.
And that expanded reach leads us nicely into what the source material calls the reading mania.
Right. Throughout the 17th and especially the 18th centuries, Europe saw a steady and pretty significant rise in literacy rates. Churches got involved in setting up schools in villages, bringing basic reading and writing skills to a much broader segment of society, including peasants and artisans. By the late 18th century, literacy rates in some parts of Europe had climbed remarkably high, maybe 60 to 80% among certain populations.
That's a huge jump in just a couple of centuries.
Yeah.
And with so many more people able to read.
There was this enormous appetite for reading material. The sources describe it as a virtual reading mania. Printers responded by just churning out books in ever-increasing numbers. And importantly, they started developing new kinds of literature specifically aimed at these new audiences.
Like what sort of stuff were people reading?
All sorts of new popular forms emerged. Booksellers started using traveling peddlers, chapmen, to sell small, really cheap books in villages and rural areas. You'd find things like almanacs, with astrological predictions and planting calendars and practical advice. Collections of ballads and folktales were hugely popular, and increasingly just reading for entertainment.
Right.
Think penny chapbooks in England, sold literally for a penny, making them affordable even for the working poor. Or the Bibliothèque Bleue in France. These were cheap, small books printed on inexpensive blue paper.
It sounds like reading became much more diverse, definitely more focused on entertainment, moving beyond just, say, religious texts or classical works.
Definitely. And from the early 18th century, we also see the rise of the periodical press newspapers and journals. These combine news about current affairs like wars and trade updates with stories, serials, and other forms of entertainment.
So print wasn't just spreading old stories or philosophy. It was connecting people to the latest news, to what was happening in the wider world.
Yes, making information about public affairs much more accessible than before. And crucially, print also played a vital role in disseminating the ideas of the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. The sources mention figures like Isaac Newton,
Right.
whose scientific discoveries influenced a wider circle through print, and thinkers like Thomas Paine, Voltaire, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Their ideas about science, reason, individual rights, rationality were widely printed and read.
So these potentially radical Enlightenment ideas, questioning traditional authority and advocating for reason, were spreading out into popular culture through print.
Exactly. The sources give a wonderful specific anecdote from James Lackington, who was a big London bookseller and publisher at the time. He wrote in his diary in 1791 about the explosion in book sales. He observed that even poor country people, who maybe used to spend their evenings telling old stories about witches and ghosts, were now listening to their children read them tales and romances that they'd bought on trips to the local town.
That small detail really brings the change to life, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Reading moving into everyday homes, even modest ones, actually changing evening routines and conversations.
It makes the impact really tangible, and this spread of print, this access to new ideas, it became strongly associated with the idea of progress, of enlightenment. The sources quote Louise Sebastian Mercier, an 18th century French novelist, who saw the printing press as the most powerful engine of progress, something capable of liberating society from despotism and tyranny.
He believed reading could literally transform individuals and, by extension, society itself.
He absolutely did. The sources include this amazing quote from Mercier where he describes just devouring books, feeling new ideas flood his brain, feeling utterly transformed by the act of reading. And he issued this direct challenge proclaiming, "Tremble, therefore, tyrants of the world, tremble before the virtual writer."
Wow. A direct threat delivered via the printed word itself. That seems like a perfect lead-in to discussing print's potential role in major historical upheavals, like, say, the French Revolution.
It's a really compelling connection, and historians have strongly argued that print culture created crucial conditions that, contributed significantly to the French Revolution. The source material outlines three main arguments for this link.
Okay, what's the first argument they present?
First, that print popularized the ideas of those Enlightenment thinkers we just mentioned, Voltaire, Rousseau, and others. They were sharply critical of tradition, superstition, despotic rule. They advocated for reason, rationality, individual rights, and their widely read writings questioned the whole basis of the old order, the divine right of kings, the sacred authority of the church. This, the argument goes, eroded the legitimacy of that old social and political system in the minds of many readers.
So print acted as the main vehicle spreading the intellectual critique of the ancient regime, the old system.
Yes, providing the sort of philosophical foundation for discontent. The second argument is that print created a new public culture of dialogue and debate. Now that people had access to these critical ideas and a means to share them widely, they began to reevaluate existing values, institutions, norms, and public discussion in coffeehouses, salons, reading clubs, and through printed pamphlets and journals. This environment, facilitated by print, allowed radical new ideas of social revolution to emerge and actually gain traction.
It created a space, a kind of public sphere, where the very idea of revolution could be conceived and discussed much more widely than before.
Exactly. It shifted important conversations out of just closed elite circles. And the third argument focuses specifically on the decade right before the revolution, the 1780s. The sources mention this absolute outpouring of literature that directly mocked and criticized the monarchy and the aristocracy, often focusing on their perceived moral failings, their decadence, their extravagance.
Like the cartoons and caricatures the source describes, showing the nobles living it up while common people suffered.
Precisely. These satirical works, often quite crude and scandalous, circulated underground, bypassing official censorship. They fostered intense hostility and contempt for the ruling class. It wasn't always high-minded philosophical critique. Sometimes it was just sharp, biting mockery that really chipped away at their public image and authority.
Those three arguments together paint a pretty strong picture of print as a driver of revolutionary sentiment. But the source material also presents a more nuanced view, doesn't it? It's not simply saying print caused the revolution.
That's a really crucial point, yeah. The sources are careful to remind us that while print was incredibly influential, it didn't operate in a vacuum. And people didn't just passively absorb everything they read. Readers were exposed to a whole mix of materials, Enlightenment ideas, sure, but also official propaganda from the monarchy and the church defending the status quo.
Okay.
And people interpreted what they read in their own ways,
Yeah.
accepting some ideas, rejecting others, maybe blending different things together.
So print didn't dictate exactly how people should think, but rather gave them the tools, the information, and maybe the permission to think differently.
That's exactly it. Print didn't directly shape minds in some uniform way, but it opened up the possibility of critical thinking. It offered a range of alternative perspectives. It provided the intellectual raw material and, crucially, that public space for discussion that made revolutionary ideas not just conceivable, but shareable and ultimately actionable for a much wider public. It was a powerful catalyst, absolutely, but still just one part of a very complex mix of factors leading to the revolution.
Okay, so as we move beyond the French Revolution and into the 19th century, print culture seems to evolve even further, reaching entirely new segments of society.
Absolutely. The 19th century witnessed massive leaps in mass literacy across Europe, far exceeding the levels we saw even in the 18th century. This brought huge numbers of entirely new readers into the fold. Children became a distinct readership, working-class people gained more access, and women's roles as readers and writers expanded significantly.
Children became a particularly important category of readers, you said.
They did. As primary education became compulsory in the late 19th century in many European countries, school textbooks obviously became a huge market. France, for instance, even developed a dedicated children's press back in 1857, producing magazines and books specifically for young readers.
And the source mentions the Grimm brothers collecting folk tales, which is interesting because it sounds like, again, traditional oral stories are now entering the world of print.
Yes, and it's another great example of print's complex influence. The Grimms collected these traditional folk tales, often from peasants, but they significantly edited them before publishing. Anything considered unsuitable or maybe too vulgar for middle-class sensibilities was often removed or changed.
Oh, okay.
So print wasn't just preserving these old stories, it was actively changing and shaping them for a new audience and a new medium, sanitizing them in a way.
Print shaping tradition, not just neutrally recording it. That's a fascinating dynamic.
It really is. Women also became increasingly central to print culture in the 19th century, both as readers and as writers. Penny magazines and other cheap periodicals were often aimed specifically at women, as were numerous manuals offering advice on everything from housekeeping to proper etiquette.
And the rise of the novel seems strongly connected to women readers during this time.
Definitely. Women were seen as a key market for novels. And importantly, some of the era's most celebrated and influential novelists were women. Think Jane Austen, the Bronte sisters, George Eliot. The sources point out that their writing, which often depicted complex female characters grappling with social constraints and seeking independence, helped to define and popularize a new kind of independent thinking woman.
So print empowering women, both by giving them access to stories and ideas and by providing a platform for their own voices and perspectives to be heard.
And access wasn't just limited to the middle or upper classes either. Lending libraries, which had existed earlier, expanded massively in the 19th century. They became crucial institutions for educating artisans, white-collar workers, and lower-middle-class individuals who maybe couldn't afford to buy many books themselves.
So working people gaining access to knowledge and literature through print in a new way.
Yes. And as working hours gradually began to shorten from the mid-19th century, people simply had more time for leisure and self-improvement. The sources mention a surge in self-educated working-class individuals writing and publishing their own political tracts, essays, pamphlets, even autobiographies.
Right.
The story of Thomas Wood, a mechanic who apparently used to rent old newspapers because he couldn't afford candles to read by at night, or Maxim Gorky's famous autobiography about his struggles, they really reflect this intense desire for literacy and self-expression among working people.
These are powerful testaments to print enabling agency and voice for those who were previously often on the margins of literate society.
Absolutely.
Oh, yeah.
Meanwhile, the technology of printing itself just kept advancing. It didn't stand still. The 19th and early 20th centuries saw continuous innovation. Presses shifted from wood to metal, making them much more durable and efficient. Richard M. Hoe in New York perfected the power-driven cylindrical press by the mid-19th century, which could print an incredible 8,000 sheets per hour, absolutely essential for the booming newspaper industry.
8,000 sheets an hour. I mean, compare that back to Gutenberg's 180 Bibles in 3 years.
Sure.
The scale is just mind-boggling.
It's a staggering leap, isn't it? Further innovations included the offset press, which allowed for high-quality multicolor printing. Electrically operated presses came in during the early 20th century, and there were significant improvements in paper production, ink, and the quality of printing plates. The sources emphasize that these cumulative improvements utterly transformed the speed, the cost, and the whole aesthetic quality of printed texts over time.
And publishers presumably had to get creative to actually sell this massive explosion of printed output.
Oh, absolutely. New business strategies emerged to reach this mass market. Serials became hugely popular, publishing novels and periodicals chapter by chapter to keep readers hooked and coming back for the next issue. Cheap series like the Shilling series emerged in England. The dust cover for books, believe it or not, is actually a 20th century innovation mentioned in the sources, designed to protect the book and attract buyers.
I never thought about when dust covers started.
And during the Great Depression in the 1930s, publishers introduced cheap paperback editions specifically to make books affordable even during severe economic hardship. They adapted to the market.
All these strategies aim squarely at getting print into the hands of a true mass market. And print wasn't just confined to books and periodicals anymore by this point, was it?
No, not at all. The sources really highlight how print became ubiquitous in public spaces. Think advertisements, public notices, posters plastered on street walls, on public buildings, especially at busy hubs like railway stations.
You really couldn't avoid print anymore. It was saturating the visual environment, part of the landscape.
It was absolutely everywhere you looked. And the sources prompt us to consider the impact of this constant visual barrage. Did everyone react to or interpret these ubiquitous advertisements and notices in the same way? Probably not.
That's a good question. Now, this global history of print also has a really vital and distinct chapter in India. How did print arrive and take root there?
Well, India had its own deep and incredibly rich tradition of handwritten manuscripts dating back centuries in numerous languages: Sanskrit, Arabic, Persian, and many, many vernacular tongues.
Like the beautiful, sometimes illuminated manuscripts the source shows images of, on palm leaves or paper.
Exactly those, copied painstakingly by scribes on palm leaves or handmade paper, often with intricate illustrations, sometimes bound with decorative wooden covers. And importantly, this manuscript production didn't just stop dead when print arrived. It continued well into the late 19th century alongside print.
But like in Europe, these manuscripts had their limitations, right?
Yes, the sources point out the familiar issues. They were expensive to commission, fragile, often awkward to handle or read, and their circulation was naturally quite limited. An interesting detail from the sources is that in pre-colonial Bengal, students in village schools, pathshalas, often primarily learned to write rather than to extensively read texts. They relied more on teachers orally transmitting knowledge from the manuscripts the teacher possessed.
So literacy didn't automatically mean the kind of widespread individual reading of texts we might assume today.
Not necessarily in the same way, no. The very first printing press in India actually arrived with Portuguese missionaries and go way back in the mid-16th century.
Missionaries again, just like the story in Japan. Seems to be a pattern.
Yes, very often they were the initial carriers of the technology. They learned local languages like Konkani and began printing religious tracts. By 1674, the sources say about 50 books had been printed in Konkani and Kannada. Catholic priests printed the first book in Tamil in 1579 and the first in Malayalam in 1713. Later, Dutch Protestant missionaries also got involved, printing Tamil texts.
So early print in India, much like in early Europe, was strongly tied to religious purposes and focused on local languages initially.
Primarily, yes. The English language press actually grew much later, interestingly, even though the British East India Company had imported presses earlier, mainly for their own administrative use. It was private English enterprise that really kicked off commercial English printing in India in 1780 with James Augustus Hickey's Bengal Gazette.
Oh yes, Hickey's paper. The source describes it as fiercely independent, but it quickly ran into trouble with the authorities, didn't it?
It certainly did. Hickey published a lot of critical commentary, gossip, and exposés about senior East India Company officials. The Governor General at the time, Warren Hastings, didn't take kindly to it at all. He persecuted Hickey, seized his press eventually, and actively encouraged the publication of officially sanctioned newspapers to counter Hickey's criticisms and, present the British colonial administration in a more favorable light.
So right from its commercial beginnings in India, print was immediately a site of conflict, independent voices versus attempts at control by those in power.
Absolutely. That dynamic was there from the start. By the late 18th century, we start seeing other newspapers emerge, including some run by Indians themselves, like Gangadhar Bhattacharya's Bengal Gazette, which apparently had close ties to the famous reformer Ramamohun Roy. The sources also mention a fascinating notice from 1768 by an Englishman named William Bolts, advertising in Calcutta, seeking printers because he wanted to start a press, showing the demand existed even before widespread printing had really taken root among the local population.
So print is established, initially driven by missionaries and then colonial private enterprise. How does it then become this major catalyst for social and religious change and debate within Indian society itself?
Well, from the early 19th century onwards, print became absolutely central to the really intense religious and social reform debates that swept across India. You had different groups grappling with the impact of colonial rule, with modernization, offering new interpretations of religious beliefs, challenging existing social customs, formulating new ideas of identity.
And print allowed these complex, often heated debates to move into a much more public sphere.
Exactly. Printed tracts, pamphlets, and especially newspapers spread new ideas and arguments quickly and widely. This fundamentally shaped the very nature of these public debates. It allowed a much wider segment of society to participate, even if just by reading about the different viewpoints being argued back and forth. This, in turn, led to the emergence of entirely new ideas and positions, born out of these clashes of opinion playing out in print.
Like the famous controversies in Bengal the source mentions, between reformers and Hindu orthodoxy.
Yes, that's a classic example. Reformers like Ramamohun Roy published newspapers like the Sambat Kaumudi to argue for changes like the abolition of sati. Hindu orthodoxy responded by commissioning their own papers, like the Samachar Chandrika, to oppose him and defend traditional practices. And crucially, they printed these arguments in accessible, everyday Bengali language, not just scholarly Sanskrit, precisely to reach the widest possible audience.
So print made these complex theological and social debates understandable and accessible to the general public, not just the elite scholars.
Absolutely. And this wasn't just limited to Hindu reformers and Orthodox groups. In North India, Muslim ulama religious scholars were anxious about the decline of Muslim political power under the British and feared colonial interference in Islamic law. They extensively used print. They utilized cheap lithographic presses.
Which is a simpler printing method, right? Using stones.
Yeah, right. Simpler than setting metal type. They used these presses to publish translations of the Quran and other scriptures, religious newspapers, and collections of fatwas, legal pronouncements on Islamic practice issued by influential seminaries like the one at Deoband.
So using print proactively to provide guidance and maintain religious authority in a rapidly changing world.
Yes, precisely. And Urdu print, in particular, became a key battleground for different Muslim sects and seminaries to engage in public debates and try to expand their influence among the community. For Hindus, too, print fundamentally changed access to religious texts. It strongly encouraged the reading of scriptures, especially in vernacular languages, not just Sanskrit.
Making sacred texts portable and affordable, I imagine, for the first time for many people.
Exactly. The first printed edition of Tulsidas's incredibly popular Ramcharitmanas, an epic poem about Ram, came out in Calcutta in 1810. Cheap lithographic editions of religious books just flooded the market, produced by major publishing houses like the Naval Kishore Press in Lucknow and the Sri Venkateshwar Press in Bombay.
So ordinary people could now buy a printed copy relatively cheaply compared to commissioning a costly, handwritten manuscript.
Precisely. These printed religious texts were portable, easy to read anywhere. They could be read individually or, importantly, read aloud to groups of illiterate people, facilitating discussions within families and local communities. This whole process spurred intense discussions and sometimes controversies, both within Hinduism and between different religious groups, all playing out in the public sphere created by print.
And print also connected people across wider distances, didn't it? Fostering a sense of shared identity beyond the local.
Yes, newspapers in particular were crucial here. They conveyed news between distant parts of India, helping to create a sense of connection and eventually contributing to the rise of pan-Indian identities and nationalism. The sources include some great quotes from 19th century Indian newspapers stating their purpose explicitly.
Well,
Things like providing useful local information, enabling free discussion on matters of general utility, science, history, geography, and importantly, acting as a kind of opposition voice in a country without a representative parliament by critiquing government policy.
so print, creating both a shared information space and a vital platform for political expression and critique across a vast and diverse territory.
Crucial element in the development of national consciousness, absolutely.
Print also seems to have fostered entirely new forms of publication and brought previously unheard voices to the forefront in India, much like in Europe.
It absolutely did. As literacy grew, there was this massive appetite for new kinds of stories and information that reflected readers' own lives, their feelings, their concerns. This led to the emergence of new literary forms, most notably the novel, which was adapted to Indian contexts and themes. Novels gave readers a sense of the diversity of human experiences and social realities around them. Shorter forms like lyrics, short stories, and essays on social and political topics also proliferated rapidly thanks to print.
And print wasn't just about text, was it? It spurred a whole new visual culture in India, too.
A huge impact there, yes. The ability of print presses to reproduce images easily and cheaply led to a boom in visual culture. Painters like the famous Ravi Varma set up their own printing presses to produce mass-market color prints and calendars featuring mythological scenes and portraits. These became incredibly popular, affordable even for poorer households to buy and decorate their homes with. Cheap bazaar art, woodcuts, lithographs, all printed shaped popular ideas about religion, society, modernity, tradition.
So print was shaping people's views and aesthetics not just through words, but through these widely available shared images.
Yes, a whole visual language of print emerged, and from the 1870s onwards, journals began featuring caricatures and cartoons that commented directly on social and political issues. They often poked fun at educated Indians who seemed to be overly adopting Western styles and manners. They expressed anxiety about rapid social change, and they also served nationalist goals by satirizing imperial rule and its officials. The journal Indian Charivari is an example mentioned in the sources.
Visual public commentary, often satirical, on the rapid social and political transformations happening. And the source material specifically pulls out the impact of print on women in India. That seems like a really significant area.
A very important development, yes. Reading increased enormously among women in middle-class homes, often encouraged by liberal fathers or husbands. The establishment of girls' schools, though limited initially, also played a role. Journals specifically aimed at women emerged, carrying women's own writings, promoting education, discussing social reforms, and sometimes even providing curriculum material for homeschooling.
But I understand there was significant resistance, even fear, surrounding the idea of educating women.
Yes, considerable resistance and deep-seated fear. Conservative voices, both Hindu and Muslim, worried intensely about the consequences of educating women. Some genuinely feared that a literate girl might be doomed to early widowhood, a common superstition. Others worried that educated women would become corrupted by reading romances or novels, neglecting their domestic duties.
Wow.
But the sources highlight these incredible stories of rebel women who defied these restrictions. For example, there's an account of a conservative Muslim girl in North India who secretly learned to read and write Urdu in her home, even though her family only wanted her to read the Arabic Quran. Or the famous story of Rashsundari Devi in Bengal.
Tell me about her.
She taught herself to read and write in utter secrecy within her Orthodox household, literally stealing pages from her husband's religious books and hiding them. She later wrote the first full-length autobiography by a Bengali woman, Mar Jiban, My Life, a remarkable account published in 1876.
Incredible stories of personal bravery and determination just to gain literacy.
And print gave these women, and others, a voice to share their experiences and critiques. Women writers like Kailash Bashini Devi in Bengal, Tarabai Shinde in Maharashtra, and Pandita Ramabai, who wrote in Marathi and later lectured widely. They used print powerfully to expose the harsh realities of women's lives, their confinement within the home, their lack of education, the drudgery of domestic labor, the social injustices they face.
Right.
There's a really poignant quote from a Tamil novel mentioned in the sources that resonates deeply. A female character says something like, "For various reasons, my world is small. More than half my life's happiness has come from books."
That quote powerfully conveys how reading could provide escape, knowledge, and fulfillment, especially under highly restrictive social conditions.
Absolutely. Print specifically for women's education grew significantly, particularly in Hindi, starting from the 1870s. Popular women's journals flourished in the early 20th century, covering a wide range of topics: social reform, the growing national movement, domestic advice, health, fashion, entertainment.
But even here, print wasn't monolithic, right? It reflected contradictory ideas about women's roles.
Oh, absolutely. The sources note that alongside progressive ideas about female education and emancipation, there were examples, say, in Punjab, where folk literature was printed specifically to teach women obedience and traditional virtues. Things like Istridharm Vichar, ideas on the duties of women.
Okay.
And in Calcutta, there was this area called the Tala, famous for producing huge quantities of cheap, popular, and incredibly diverse books covering everything from religious stories and scriptures to sensational scandals, popular romances, guides to letter writing. These often reached women readers through traveling peddlers.
A real mix of content.
A huge mix. And woodcuts from this Batala press era, mentioned in the sources, visually depict some of the anxieties surrounding social change and shifting gender roles, sometimes showing satirical caricatures of, say, a modern wife dominating her husband, or traditional family structures being undermined.
So print was very much a site where conflicting ideas about women, modernity, and tradition were being actively debated and disseminated visually and textually.
A real battleground of ideas, yes. And the source material also makes a point of discussing how print reached poor people in India, which is notable given the potential barriers of cost and literacy.
Right. How did that happen? How did print penetrate down the social ladder?
Several ways, apparently. First, the availability of very cheap, small books sold in public markets, often at crossroads or near temples where poor people gathered on their way to or from work or town markets. These were accessible. Second, from the early 20th century, public libraries began to be established, sometimes sponsored by wealthy patrons or local bodies seeking prestige. While mainly in towns and cities initially, they sometimes reached prosperous villages, expanding access beyond just buying books.
And print became a crucial tool in the fight against social injustice, specifically mentioning caste discrimination.
Absolutely critical there. From the late 19th century onwards, writings explicitly addressing caste discrimination and the injustices of the caste system began appearing much more widely in printed tracts, essays, and books. Figures like Jyotiba Phule in Maharashtra wrote powerfully against caste oppression in works like his Gulamgiri, Slavery. In the 20th century, leaders like B.R. Ambedkar, himself from an untouchable background, and E.V. Swami Naikar, known as Periyar in South India, used print extensively: newspapers, pamphlets, books to reach audiences across India, challenging caste hierarchies, critiquing Hindu scriptures that sanctioned caste, and advocating powerfully for equality and social justice. Local protest movements against caste also used journals and tracts to voice their grievances and articulate visions for a more just future.
So print giving voice and reach to the struggle against deeply entrenched social inequality.
Absolutely. And workers, too, found a voice through print, even under difficult conditions. Factory workers, often overworked and with limited formal education, sometimes managed to write and publish their experiences. The sources mention Kashi Baba, a Kanpur mill worker who wrote Chote Aur Bed Ka Saal, The Question of Big and Small, in 1938, linking the issues of caste and class exploitation. Another mill worker from Bangalore, Sudarshan Shankar, had his poems collected and published as Sachi Kavitayam, True Poems. Workers even actively set up their own libraries and reading rooms, like in Bangalore and Bombay, sometimes sponsored by social reformers who saw literacy and access to information as key to social upliftment, and increasingly as linked to the goals of the nationalist movement.
Print truly enabled agency and provided a platform for so many marginalized voices across various social stratifications in India. It's quite remarkable.
Which leads us, perhaps inevitably, to the response from those in power when such powerful tools for change become widespread attempts at control and censorship.
Right. The colonial state in India certainly tried to control print, especially as it became more critical.
They did, but the sources note an interesting evolution in their approach. Early controls, say before 1798, were actually primarily aimed at censoring critical Englishmen living and working in India, not so much Indians themselves initially.
Really? Why the Englishmen?
Because their writings, which often exposed corruption, mismanagement, or criticized company policies, could potentially damage the East India Company's image and interests back in Britain, where Parliament held ultimate oversight. They were worried about washing their dirty linen in public back home.
That's surprising. So initially they were more concerned about their reputation in London than about what Indians might be writing.
Yes, that seems to have been the primary concern early on. But after the massive revolt of 1857, the Sepoy Mutiny, or First War of Independence, depending on perspective, everything changed. The colonial administration became much more fearful and suspicious. Enraged Englishmen in India demanded a harsh crackdown on the native press, which was becoming increasingly nationalistic in tone and openly critical of colonial rule.
And this is where the infamous Vernacular Press Act comes into the picture.
Exactly. Passed in 1878, it was modeled directly on similar repressive press laws used against the Irish nationalist press in Ireland. It gave the government sweeping powers to censor newspapers published in Indian languages, the vernacular press. They could track reports, issue official warnings, and if a newspaper ignored the warnings and continued publishing seditious material, the authorities could seize its printing press and confiscate its security deposit.
A direct legislative weapon aimed squarely at suppressing the rising tide of nationalist sentiment being expressed through print.
Absolutely. But attempts to suppress nationalist criticism often backfire spectacularly. They frequently provoked even more militant protest and resistance, leading to this escalating cycle of government persecution, followed by public outrage and further nationalist activity.
A classic example being
a key example highlighted in the sources is the imprisonment of the influential nationalist leader Bal Gangadhar Tilak in 1908. He was jailed for his writings in his Marathi newspaper Kasari, where he defended revolutionaries who had used violence. His imprisonment triggered widespread protests and strikes across India, showing how attacks on press freedom were seen as attacks on the nationalist movement itself.
So print became this crucial battlefield in the independence struggle, where attempts at control actually fueled further resistance.
Absolutely. Some editors demonstrated remarkable courage, even refusing government subsidies designed to influence their editorial line, choosing financial hardship over compromising their independence. Controls intensified significantly during periods of crisis, particularly during the World Wars. The Defense of India rules during World War I and later the Defense of India Act during World War II allowed the government to impose pre-censorship, censor reports about the war effort, and suppress news about nationalist campaigns like the Quit India movement in 1942. Many newspapers were suppressed or forced to shut down during these periods.
The fight for print freedom became deeply, inextricably intertwined with the broader fight for national freedom.
Absolutely. And the sources powerfully conclude this section with Mahatma Gandhi's statement from 1922. He was defending himself during his trial for sedition based on articles published in his journal, Young India. He explicitly declared that the fight for Swaraj, for self-rule, was intrinsically linked to the fight for three fundamental freedoms: liberty of speech, liberty of the press, and freedom of association.
So he saw freedom of the press not just some desirable civic right, but as absolutely fundamental to the very concept of self-governance and national liberation.
It was core to the political struggle, in his view, foundational.
What an incredible journey we've traced from the painstaking, almost meditative hand-carving of wood blocks in East Asia centuries ago, through the revolutionary technical leap of movable type kicking off in Europe, exploding into this global mechanized force that has reshaped continents, cultures, and societies in profound ways.
It really drives home the point that print culture wasn't just about making more books faster. It fundamentally altered the entire landscape of human interaction, knowledge dissemination, and public discourse. It created new kinds of publics, facilitated widespread debate on literally everything from religion and science to politics and social customs. It provided powerful tools to challenge established authority. It spread Enlightenment ideas, fueled social reform movements, powered nationalist struggles, and critically, it gave voice over time to millions who were previously largely unheard women, the working poor, marginalized caste groups.
And yet, throughout its history, it faced constant pressure and resistance from those in power who feared its uncontrollable ability to disseminate dissenting thought, inconvenient information, and alternative perspectives. It truly seems to have changed everything, from our intimate everyday reading habits and access to information, right up to the grand sweep of major historical events and the very structure of modern society.
For centuries, print was arguably the single most powerful engine for circulating ideas, knowledge, and public opinion on a large scale across vast distances, shaping the world we inherited.
So here is a thought for you, our listeners, to take with you from this deep dive. In our contemporary age, an age increasingly dominated by digital information, the internet, social media platforms, how does the historical trajectory of print culture its immense power to inform, inspire, provoke, and challenge, and crucially, the reactions it consistently elicited from those seeking control. How does that long history continue to resonate with, or perhaps offer insights into, our current information landscape?
Think about that. Are the dynamics we've discussed, the struggles over access, the potential for widespread debate, the amplification of new or previously silenced voices, and the persistent attempts at regulation and control, are they playing out in similar or perhaps new and more complex ways in the digital realm today? Maybe the centuries-long story of print offers some important lessons, or at least some valuable perspectives for navigating the information world we live in now.